Thank you for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, at least virtually at the very least. Um, yeah, so I applied for an academic job once 9 years ago and I got a job. So clearly I'm an expert on it and clearly I'm qualified to tell you guys how to do this. But that's actually not the reason I'm typically invited to give this talk. The reason is actually because of this, which is a blog post I wrote shortly after getting my job. And I titled it Get a Job, Ken, which was the mantra running through my head as I was a postdoc trying to get a job. And I basically conveyed every piece of information, advice, tips, tricks, whatever it was to try to give people, demystify the process, like I said. So it turned out to be really popular. And so outside of my photophysics and photochemistry committee, anytime I go to a conference, I'm probably most well known for this blog post, which is kind of crazy, but I'll take it. Any visibility is good visibility. And so before diving into the meat and bones of that blog post, I just wanted to give you some context on my journey towards being an academic. And so I started out in Foley, Minnesota. This is a small town of about 1,600 people. You've probably never heard of it. All I did was sports in high school. That was my primary focus. And my lowest grade in high school is actually chemistry, which, again, I'm a PhD chemist at this point. So, yeah, kind of surprised that everything turned out the way it did. But after that, I went to St. Cloud State University, which, again, you've probably never heard of unless you're a big hockey fan. They're really popular in hockey. But I went there because I was a walk-on in track and field and eventually got a scholarship and was eventually a captain of the track team. And so my progression through majors actually reflected my interest in sports. And so I changed majors 4 times during undergrad. I changed it from athletic training to exercise science to biomedical science to chemistry. Believe it or not, I fell in love with chemistry in the organic chemistry class, which is one people usually hate. Turns out I really liked it. I really liked controlling molecules and being able to manipulate structures and things like that. And so after deciding I wanted to do chemistry, I had a couple advisors tell me, hey, you should do summer undergraduate research institution opportunities. And so NSFRU programs, my first flight ever getting on an airplane was to go to Notre Dame to do research with Slavi Sivov. And then the subsequent summer, I went to UCLA with Rick Kaner and spent a summer working on polyaniline and conducting polymers. And so after that, I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, wanted to do chemistry. And so ultimately, I got accepted into the University of Southern California, the other USC, and worked with Dr. Mark Thompson. And so I was working on molecular photophysics and photochemistry, a lot of synthesis, making dyes and applying them in OLEDs, photodetectors, and organic photovoltaics. And then I drove across the country to North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I did a postdoc with Thomas J. Meyer at UNC Chapel Hill. And there I was doing primarily spectroscopy, so like optical measurements of materials, particularly for application of solar fuels, trying to take chemicals and turn them, taking low energy chemicals and turning them into high energy chemicals for fuels. So doing a lot of transient absorption and emission and studying stabilities of these materials. So that was 2010 to 2013. And so at some point in 2012, I did realize that I had to move on and join the real world, right? I couldn't stay in academia forever, and so I did have to get a job. I knew somewhere along the way I wanted to go into academia. I wanted to be a teacher and a researcher, but it's one of those things I didn't necessarily know what I was doing. And so for those of you not familiar, there's a lot of institutions that pump out faculty members, right? The MITs, the Caltechs, the top 10 programs in the world, they are producing academics all the time. But I came from groups where it wasn't that common for someone to go to academia. So I didn't see 3 cohorts of grad students or postdocs before me apply for this job process. And so I did what anyone would naturally do. I went to Google and said, how do I get a faculty position in chemistry? And the answer is there was no real useful results from that search, at least at the time I did this in 2012. There wasn't a lot of information online of what the process was, what the steps were. And so really I just kind of had to make it up as I go. But I did consult a lot of people, my advisors, junior faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, honestly, anyone that was willing to talk to me about the process. And ultimately it came down to a lot of trial and error. Just go along, learn as much as you can during the process. So looking at the numbers, when I applied for jobs, I applied for 28 R1 institutions. That's what I focused on, no external jobs to that. I got 4 interviews and 1 formal job offer, and I accepted a position at FSU. Interestingly, these statistics coincide directly with Chris's. So Chris, I fit the model. That's a take-home or consolation of any kind. But it's surprising to see, median 1 job offer, and I was very happy I got that offer. So ended up joining the faculty at Florida State University. And so me now in 2022, I was an assistant professor, just got promoted in 2019 to associate, again, Department of Chemistry as well as Material Science and Engineering. I run a group that does research on molecular photophysics and spectroscopy, so light matter interactions and how that influences behavior of materials and how you can use it in things like solar cells. But back to the blog post. And so immediately after I got the job, it was you can see the date here, April 20th, 2013. I accepted the offer sometime in February or March, and I wrote a blog post saying, here's the information that I didn't have going into this process. I said, I'm going to fill in that Google gap. I'm going to have a searchable website where somebody can find information on the job search. And it turned out to be a beast of a blog post. In fact, it was an 8-part series. And so I went over everything I could and documented everything I could in the process. And so these are 8 different blog posts going from the timeline to proposal prep, so on and so forth. And so what I'm going to do is briefly walk you through these, but I do have to give a disclaimer. This is my anecdotal experience, stories I've heard from others. Again, Chris is doing the actual data analysis to look at bigger picture. There is intrinsic survivor bias in me saying this is how you get a job because I happen to survive that process. But again, others will have different experiences and they'll have different stories to tell. And again, this is very specific for R1 institutions. I was in particular looking for materials, inorganic, physical, and energy related positions. Some of this hopefully is useful for those searching elsewhere, but again, this is central focused on R1 institutions. And so again, seek advice from as many people as you can, because who knows what piece will push you over the edge towards the job. All right, so we'll start with the timeline. Again, this is chemistry centric, but from people I've talked to, this shifts by a couple months depending on your discipline, but for the most part, it's very, very similar across the board. So generally ads start appearing sometime between July and November, and being on the other side of the process, I understand now this is the department has to go to the dean, and then the dean has to approve it, and the university has to approve it. It has to go through HR, and so there's a long convoluted process, and so there isn't like one data point that says they're all going to come out now. They will scatter throughout this entire window, and you got to keep an eye on all of those. PUIs will continue into the spring. Their openings typically go later. Application deadlines, generally, I found they were September through December is typically the window. In fact, here's a graph of the deadlines that I came across. October 15th was a very popular date, and it turns out it still is. But again, there's some as late as December, and it depends on when the job comes out, as well as what type of search is it. Is it a departmental search? Is it a university-wide search? You just got to keep your eyes open, because even openings happen after some of the deadlines. First contact, that is the university contacting candidates they want to interview. That could be really, really quick, or it can be very, very slow, anywhere between October and March. Again, early on, it's 2 weeks after the deadline. March is maybe their first round of candidates weren't viable, so they decided to search again and bring in additional people. And so it can vary dramatically. Decisions somewhere in that spring semester, somewhere between December and April. For us, we have visitation weekends in February and March, and so it's really nice that I got my offer and accepted before that deadline, the at least the March visitation. So I got to actually meet with the incoming graduate students. But again, it's a wide window when these decisions and acceptances happen. And so ultimately the start date, I think formally July 1st or August 1st were very, very common, but you can actually negotiate, maybe starting a little bit earlier. You typically can't start later because you got to teach classes in that fall semester. At least most of the time you have to do so. So yeah, a broad range of times. And so I guess the take home message from this is keep your eyes open and don't give up hope until, we'll say, April after you apply. I think that's when they start really cutting that off. But even PUIs, there'll be some offers after that time. So finding these openings is a non-trivial task, and Chris talked about this a little bit, but there's a lot of places you can read up on job applications. CNE News, Science and Nature Jobs has a pretty good website. Indeed.com, any of the just job sites, sometimes they get posted there. Inside Higher Ed and Academic Jobs Online also post. Chemistry, you have something really nice. There's 2 bloggers, ChemBark and ChemJobber, that essentially created an archive where anyone can submit a job. And so essentially, if you go to their webpage and you can search for any chemistry opening you want. And so basically, people submit this in a form and they compile it in a really nice spreadsheet that has all the information, like essentially the deadline, what they're looking for, what flavor of chemistry, what rank it is, where it's located. And this list has 589 openings for the 2022 search, which is really amazing. This definitely cuts down on your search time and lets you have one archive. And presumably this exists in other disciplines. If it doesn't, you should be the one creating it, because this is super, super useful. Fun side note on this is he has helpful links at the bottom. Get a Job, Ken there is up there on top, but also a bunch of other people recounting their academic experiences. And so there are more people telling their stories online, so you can actually read up on, again, more than one person's anecdotal evidence. So I'd recommend searching for or asking around to see if one of these exists in your discipline, because it's really, really convenient. In terms of application packages, again, this is discipline specific, but I think universally cover letter, CV/resume, and letters of recommendation are standard, plus some kind of research proposal, what you're going to do, at least at an R1 institution. Other things like teaching statement, diversity statement, transcript, plus rough budget, all those are sometimes included as well, and it's mix and match, so you really have to keep track of who's asking for what information. And then the submission process can vary dramatically too. Sometimes it's an email directly to whoever that administrator handling it is. There's departmental and university websites that have submission portals. There's also third-party hosts like Academic Jobs Online. They essentially have a mechanism where you can submit one application and click on the universities you want to submit to. So it's kind of a bulk submission. It helps your letter writers. It depersonalizes the letters a little bit, but it also makes it easier for everyone to get that information. And so arguably out of all these, I will say one of the most important things, I mean, CV, you're taking care of that already. Letters of recommendation out of your hands at some point. The thing that you can really control is ultimately this proposal. I'll argue this is the most important part of applying for an academic job, particularly at R1 institutions. And so I'll just briefly go through that one first. And so the thing about this proposal, it's not necessarily what you're going to work on, but it's more of showing who you are as a researcher, showing what flavor of chemistry you are, showing how you're going to make a difference in the world. And so this is the thing I look at first when I'm on the other side of this reviewing process. And so I think it's really important that you pay attention to it. And so generally what these proposals are, at least in chemistry and material science and engineering, is typically 2 to 3 original research ideas that are, and I'll list them here, different from your previous advisor. One thing you have to do when you're coming out in academia is become an independent researcher, right? If I'm a funding agency, why would I give the junior person money when I could give it to the senior person that's already established? And so you really have to carve your own niche that's unique and different from your advisors. You have to show that you have creativity and you have something unique to contribute to the field. And so this was something that was conveyed to me later, but this idea that, you know, you should have a 10-year letter after 5 years that says Dr. X is the world's foremost expert at Y, and you really want to convey what that Y is in your proposal for your job. You want to tell people this is what flavor I am, this is what my impact is going to be, and you get that across in the proposal. You want it to be interesting and potentially fundable. Obviously, it's not just publish or perish. You also have to get money, and so good science is not enough, right? You have to have the funding to do the science you want to do. In our department, it's mandatory you have at least one major federal grant to get tenure. So this proposal has to convey that you have the ability to get money, or you have ideas that are interesting enough to actually get you money. And so the advice for everyone is start thinking of ideas now, regardless of where you are in your career, whether you're an undergraduate, a graduate, a postdoc. It's good to start thinking about ideas. And so in grad school, this is sometimes required in terms of qualifying exams or oral exams. You have to come up with an original idea and defend it in front of the community. That's awesome. Even if you don't pursue that idea, it at least gets you thinking about how to generate those ideas, how to convey those ideas to other people. And it's good practice. Even if it's a useless idea or it gets scooped by someone, you've practiced that experience. The general advice I'd give to anyone is don't stay in your lane, right? Don't pigeonhole yourself into one particular area of research. Go out, see talks, see poster presentations by people that are outside of your domain, and you ask yourself, you know, how does this work contribute to what I'm doing? How could I contribute to their research? If you start bridging gaps, that's when you start really making a unique contribution that can modify not just one field, but 2 fields. And then you start broadening your impact across many different subdisciplines. And so one thing we did at UNC Chapel Hill is I knew several people that were interested in getting an academic job. And so we created an aspiring professor support group, which is not not exactly what it sounds like, but it was basically a cohort that said, we're going to work on this together. We're going to force each other to write. We're going to force each other to practice. So there you can see me. I'm an aspiring professor. That's Aaron Vanucci. He actually got a job at University of South Carolina. And there's Dennis Ashford, who ended up at Tusculum University at PUI. And there's Alex Lapidus. He ended up going into consulting and making the big bucks. So some of our paths diverged, but ultimately I'd say it was a success. And so the idea was you can bounce ideas off an audience. You can get a broad perspective on what your ideas are. You can share job openings. You can also set deadlines, which is important. This is not a homework assignment you want to leave till the last week. You want to be writing that proposal very, very early. And so, like I said earlier, a good idea is not enough. This is universally true both for job applications and grant proposals. We are not in a bastion of scientific purity where the purest science and the best science gets funded. No, you have to present it well. And so proposal formatting matters, presentation matters. You must convey your idea to a general audience. Keep in mind, very few people that are hiring you are exact experts in what you do. In fact, if they have an expert in what you do, chances are they don't want to hire you. You end up being redundant. And so you really have to convey your science to people that are smart, that are related to your field, but not expect them to be in your field. And so you have to convey to them, since they're not experts, why it's unique, significant, and attractive to funding agencies, because they're not necessarily the people that would review your proposals, but you got to convince them that you have a fundable idea. And so the other thing you want to have in that message is some conveyance of how you're going to actually pursue the idea. And so what are the logistic things you need? What instruments, what collaborators, what tools, what do you need to actually execute this research? And so this goes into things like budget planning and things like that, but also other collaborators potentially at the university. And so the hard part of all this is I've said you need to convey a lot, and you need to do this for 2 or 3 ideas in under 10 pages. And so this is a non-trivial process. This is much harder to write than an NSF proposal. And so again, you have 10 pages to convey all this information. But as I said earlier, this is arguably the most important part of your application to a research institution. And so this is not just based on anecdote. So here's the numbers from my blog post. This last time I looked up these numbers was 2017 in terms of the number of times this stuff was viewed. You can see most of them are under 100,000, but this one, proposal format, 371,000 views across 4 years, which is absolutely crazy. And so that could be 371,000 of the same person viewing it multiple times, but it's more likely this is the most popular across the board because it is, again, arguably the most important part of your application. And so the hard part is it's also the most ambiguous. There's no template, there's no rules on how you should write this. It's just kind of do what you're going to do, take examples from others, and maybe do something useful with those. And so what I did in my blog post is I gave just a general idea. Having looked at dozens of applications, I said there is a general strategy to have a cover page. And so the idea is, here's the overview, here's my 1 sentence in my tenure letter. Ken is going to be the foremost expert at this. Then I have proposal 1, proposal 2, proposal 3, plus a couple pretty images. And so this is, I can actually show you my example. That's exactly what it looks like. I ended up pursuing a lot of these ideas. And so the reason to do this is you cannot assume that the committee is going to read a 10-page proposal from 100 different applicants. It's just unrealistic. And so you need to convey this information as quickly and cleanly as possible. And this is essentially the TOC page of your proposal. It says, here's what I'm going to be, like it or not, read the rest if you're intrigued. If not, you still have a rough idea what I'm going to do. And the reality is this may be the only thing they look at in round 1 of screening. Right, so I have a general strategy. I'll look at the proposals first, and I will look at this cover page if they exist, and I'll say, this person overlaps too much with this part of my department, or this person's unique. Let's take a deeper look at their proposal. And so again, this cover page can do a lot to help you in the process. You are sacrificing, one of the 10 pages you have, but I think it's worth it having this summary page. In terms of the rest of the proposal, I would write it like a standard proposal. And again, this is on the blog post. Just introduce the area, limitations of current research, what your objectives are, highlight the advantages, have specific aims where you talk about actual logistics, have your approaches, have your methods listed there, the tools you need, techniques you'll use, but also convey the impact and who's going to fund this research. And I would list funding agencies in particular. I would say NSF, CHE, Chemical Structure and Mechanism Dynamics Subdivision. It's shown that you've been thinking about where the funding source is going to be, and it should put you in front of other individuals that don't have those funding opportunities listed. The last thing I do after you've put all this together, ask several people to proofread your proposals. This is just for grammatical and presentation purposes. Language and conveyance of that language matters. I have my wife, the English major, read every one of my proposals. She doesn't, she puts in gibberish for the scientific words, but the sentence structure is the same, right? There's verbs, there's nouns. She can edit my papers and make them, and proposals, and make them sound good. So again, ask people to proofread your proposal. Other content, I'll just go briefly through these. Cover letter, somewhat important. It depends. I typically don't read the cover letter. Usually it's used if there's an all-call of some kind. You could sort based on discipline and get it in the right hands of the applicants. But nonetheless, you want to do it. You want to do it well. You want to convey, what your previous research was, what your future directions are, how you might fit in the department. You could personalize it and say things like, I could see myself collaborating with these professors in your department. And so one thing I would definitely not do is screw up by submitting the wrong cover letter to the wrong department, because you're going to piss off the people that are going to reject you immediately. So I'm not going to say it's the most important part of your application, but it could hurt you really bad if you do it poorly. Beyond that, your CV, again, as Chris mentioned, your number of citations, I guess number of papers don't matter as much, but number of citations, that's the information you can convey in your CV. So people can actually look at that information concisely. I have no silver bullet for formatting or expectation of what you include on your CV. I would put education and publications first, because that's what I would like to look at when reviewing a CV. But again, consult as many people as possible, see what their CVs look like, and maybe something useful will come out of that. Beyond that, teaching statements, I'm going to say something bold and say these are mostly useless for R1 institution applications. They require them, but I doubt anyone has gotten a job because they had an excellent teaching statement. Again, you might get rejected if it's terrible, but it's unlikely to push you over the edge. And so I would deprioritize this over other things. Typically, it's like, one-page summary of your teaching philosophies, teaching awards, teaching backgrounds. Again, at an R1 institution, doesn't matter that much, but at a PUI, this could be something important. The one thing I would recommend you do, regardless of R1 or PUI, is go to their catalog of courses and say exactly what courses you teach. Some departments are actually looking at filling a gap, and a teaching gap that they have in their program. And if your course is listed at that, be flexible. Here I'll teach Gen Chem, organic, inorganic. I don't care. I'll teach anything you want within a reasonable boundaries. List the actual classes and the course numbers to show, one, you've done your homework, but two, you're willing to teach classes that they might need filled. Beyond that, letters of recommendation. These are largely out of your hands, except you're going to need to push your advisors to get those letters in. And so let your letter writers know well in advance. You're going to go up for the academic cycle. You're going to need a job at some point. Let them know that that's coming. Send them a list of where you're going to be applying and how they submit it. Also keep track of it. And so here's a spreadsheet that I was using in terms of where people submitted their letters of recommendation, when the deadline is, and when I needed to start hounding them. If it was a week before the deadline and I saw white space here, I said, all right, I got to contact them to submit their letter. And so you got to keep on top of them. It's not that they're malicious, it's that they're busy people and it's hard for them to get on top of stuff like this. So you got to help keep track of that process. Other stuff, diversity statements. These are becoming increasingly popular. I know University of California schools require them. It's basically a statement saying how you will push to increase underrepresented minorities in STEM, how you will address diversity issues, diversity in the classroom, diversity in research. It's basically the broader impacts of the hiring process. And so I won't give any advice on this. I think I had to write one of these in 2012. I think they're much more popular now. Search online or talk to your Postdoc Association. They will have information on this. A few of the proposals actually required a rough budget proposal. And so this is one of the, if they can't afford a $500,000 instrument, they're not going to consider you as a candidate. Again, it's not out of the 28. I had one or two that actually asked for a budget, but it was good that I had that off the top of my head. And so you could ask your advisor, you could ask, junior faculty in your department roughly what a reasonable startup is for the things you want to do, and include that number. And honestly, if you want to do something that's too expensive for the given department you're applying to, you don't want to be there anyway, because you can't pursue the research you want. And so this is good to include. All right, after that, you're going to submit and you're going to wait. And so, as part of the submission process, I strongly recommend generating an independent folder for each of these guys. Each institution you're going to apply to. Again, you don't want to submit the wrong cover letter to the wrong university. If I see I'm applying to University of Florida at FSU, it's going to rub me the wrong way. And so, keep track of the contents, what they require, and what you need to submit with each of these applications, and make sure you get them in. Not only that, get them in on time, because they're not hard deadlines, but if you want to be priority decision making, if you want to be in the initial pile that's evaluated, you want to get everything in on time. And then you wait and wait and wait, and that is the worst part. It's out of your hands and it's out of your control, and it is terrible if you're really excited about a given job, but you don't have any control over the process. You can end up waiting several months to get a phone call. And so time is running short. I'll just mention this briefly. Phone and Zoom interviews since the pandemic have become increasingly popular, at least anecdotally, that's what I've heard. Our department does more Zoom interviews now than we used to. It used to be exclusively in person. And it's just to get a feel for who the person is as a candidate, general idea of their research, how are they conveying their ideas, what do they want to teach, how do they communicate back and forth, are they interested in the program? It's just a really quick and easy and inexpensive way to screen people before inviting them out for an in-person interview. And then the in-person interview, at least in chemistry, it's a 2-day marathon. You meet with people all day. It's nonstop, lunch, breakfast, dinner, all of it. It is an interview, and it is nonstop for a 2-day process, and it is absolutely exhausting. I remember going at the end of my second day of my first interview, just like laying down on a hotel room bed just to relax after the stress and the continuous nature of it. But the biggest parts of this are arguably the research seminar and the proposal seminar. And so research seminar is basically for us is what you've done in the past, and then proposal seminar is here's what I plan to do in the future. So you don't have a lot of time to convey this information, but this is your opportunity. That and one-on-one interactions show you're, collegial person, you're amicable, you're interested in their research, try to get them interested in yours. That is your best bet at getting a job. And so that was my flash through this 8-part blog post. I actually skipped the last 2 parts because that's ultimately after you get an offer or after you get an interview and you're going to go do the job, the actual in-person interview. I have additional information there on the offer and second visits and negotiations. So I strongly recommend taking a look at the blog post with more information than I'm giving you here. And if you ultimately land a job, I did a follow-up blog post about 2 years ago called Can Keep Your Job, which is my advice to new assistant professors. After you get the job, just how to hit the ground running, how to deal with things like management and funding and gaining prominence. I, again, conveyed everything I could to help out those that are blazing this trail after me. So, job advice. If nothing else, you can see a before and after tenure for Ken Hanson. So there's me in 2013 and me in 2019. So they aged horribly. This is what this job does to you. All right, so I'll close with that. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I think we have a couple minutes. If nothing else, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Our research group does one pretty photo a week, and it's a lot of glowy and colorful stuff. And so even if you don't like our science, our pictures are pretty spectacular. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time.